Hi everyone, my name is Rodney Appiah and I'm the chairman and co-founder of Cornerstone Partners. So as you consider the different funding options that are available to your business at different stages of the funding journey, I think the first thing to say is that there's a lot of different options. Let's say, for example, bootstrapping. It's a term that you might come across a few times. Bootstrapping effectively means that you're using the internal cash that's generated from the business itself and your savings to support its growth. So you're not seeking external funding, you're not reaching out to the government or to the banks, you're simply using your own internal cash to grow the business. Now, this can be quite an effective strategy if your business has high barriers to entry. In other words, it's difficult for other businesses to replicate what you're trying to achieve. It can also be a very effective strategy if your business is relatively easy to scale and doesn't require lots of capital. So that often is the best route of course for your business because it's non-dilutive. In other words, you get to keep more of your company, more of your equity. But there are other sources of non-dilutive funding that are available to you. Take, for example, grants. Grants are effectively sources of capital that are provided for a public benefit or specific purpose that doesn't require any dilution or exchange of equity. And there are a number of different organisations that are available inside and outside of the UK that can provide that funding to you. Consider, for example, Innovate UK, that's seeking to promote innovation within the United Kingdom by providing grants through competitions over several periods across the year. Also consider reaching out to governments. Governments have grant checkers, different grant schemes that are available throughout the year depending on the type of business that you are running. So certainly look at that as another route and another avenue. And now we move into some what we refer to as sort of professional sources of funding. And they typically fall into two buckets. The first bucket is debt. Debt capital or debt funding is essentially a loan into your business. And so there's an expectation from the lender to you, the borrower, that you are going to return that capital after a certain period of time. That debt tends to be quite restrictive in terms of the requirements and obligations that are placed on that funding. They might be keen to check in with you once in a while. They might ask you to abide by certain covenants. Covenants are effectively tests that your business needs to pass on a periodic basis to ensure that you're trading sensibly. And they might ask for certain information rights to ensure that the business is performing as it should. So debt can be quite restrictive, but again, it's non-dilutive, so it can be quite an attractive option for you and your business. The other form of professional funding is equity. And equity can be a really attractive source of funding for your company, particularly if you're looking for more than just money. If you're looking for advice, expertise, and support. Equity is essentially money provided by individuals or institutions to support your growth, but in exchange, they're looking to own a part of your business. View them as junior partners in your company. They're seeking to work with you, hand in glove, to help you to achieve your goals and your objectives. It is expensive because you are giving up some of your company, but in exchange for that transaction, you do get some expertise around the table. You get a sounding board, you get contacts, you potentially can get some new clients, you get expertise from individuals that have been there, done it, and worn the t-shirt. So consider equity as a potential route, of course. The main sources of equity can be provided through angel groups, which are essentially individuals that provide money and invest their own money into your business. Venture capital firms, which are institutions that invest other people's money into your company. And the government. The government can also provide equity into your business, either through organisations like the British Business Bank or other government-backed organisations. When you're considering which funding source best meets your business, think about four key areas. The first thing is, does your business have high or low barriers to entry? By barriers to entry, what I'm really referring to is it easy for your business to be replicated by a competitor? If it's easy for the business to be replicated by a competitor, then that business has low barriers to entry or weak barriers to entry. If it's very difficult for that business to be replicated by a competitor, then it has very high barriers to entry. And this is a really important distinction because if your business has high barriers to entry, it means that you have time. You have time to build the business, you have time to scale it, you have time to perfect product market fit. And as a consequence, the need to raise external capital is lower than if your business has weak barriers to entry. If you have weak barriers to entry, it means that your business could be very easily replicated. And so you don't have time to build your presence. And so in order to outrun your competitor, you need to raise capital. So that's a really, really important consideration. Consider the barriers to entry. The second key consideration for your company is the amount of capital that is required in order for your business to achieve break-even cash flow. In other words, at what point does your business become profitable? If your business is capital intensive, in other words, it needs a lot of capital in order to achieve its objective. For example, it needs to buy heavy modes of equipment, it needs to source significant physical sites, it needs to invest in product or technology, then it's much more likely that you'll need external capital versus the preferred route, which is to bootstrap your company. If your business is relatively low capital intensive, and therefore it can scale relatively easy, for example, an e-commerce business that ultimately just relies on a useful and functional website, then the need to raise capital in the first instance is low. And so that need around capital requirement is very, very important. Those, I would say, are the two key areas to think about when you're considering funding. There are two other important areas that you might want to consider. The third is, are you seeking dilutive or non-dilutive funding? Some sources of funding are dilutive. In other words, you have to give up a part of your business in order to attract that funding, namely equity. Equity is a dilutive source of funding. There are a number of non-dilutive sources of funding, such as debt, grants, and other sources, but some of those options can be quite restrictive. So be mindful of the sources of funding that you're seeking for your company. The last important consideration is the stage of your business. Typically, during the earliest stages of your company, it's far more appropriate to raise equity funding than it is to raise debt funding. And the sole reason for that is that debt funding can be quite restrictive. There's an obligation that's placed on you as a founder to ensure that you repay that principal within a given period of time. As an early stage business, you have lots of demands that are placed on you. Demands to grow the business, to perfect the product market fit, to ensure that the business is continuing to win customers and scale on the top line. The last thing you need is to have a bank manager chasing you behind you and asking for their money back. That restrictive nature and lack of flexibility can sometimes work against you in creating a profitable and thriving business. So if you're at the very early stages of your company, consider maybe going to friends and family, consider bootstrapping, maybe even consider working with angel groups rather than raising debt capital. Only consider raising debt capital if you're confident that you can service that cash flow. Service not only the interest that the debt is almost certainly going to require, but also that you can repay the capital within a certain period of time. So you might have reached a really exciting point in your journey where you're at the point where you're ready to meet investors and raise capital. You might be wondering, what are investors looking for when they're seeking to assess your company? And the truth of the matter is, it depends. Investors have different approaches to assessing the quality of the deal flow that they see. Most of the time, that assessment is based on their investment thesis. In other words, their strategy for sourcing particular types of companies that meet certain types of criteria. For example, some investors prefer to invest in a particular sector, backing consumer companies or media companies. Other investors prefer to back particular types of business models, i.e. software businesses. And so that's a really important consideration. But if we put that consideration to one side, here are some general buckets and categories of things to think about when approaching investors. I think it falls into mainly three core areas. The first is the team. What is the quality, the breadth, and the capability of your team? It's probably the most important consideration for investors. Does the team have complementary skill sets? Are the team fully aligned with your vision for the company? Does your team have a track record of building businesses of a similar type in that nature? These considerations are really, really important. Are there any notable gaps in your team? If they are, you need to explain them and have a very clear plan for addressing them. Really focus on the nature and the capability of your team, because for most investors, team is critical to the success of your company. It's often said that it's far, far better to back an A-class team with a B-class product than to back an A-class product with a B-class team. So remember that. So the second consideration is the business model. In other words, how are you going to make a return for investors over the long term. It's really, really important. And the reason for this is that you've got to understand that investing in early stage companies comes with a lot of risk. In the UK, the average startup failure rate is around about 60 to 70%. And so taking that into consideration, investors need to believe that for every pound they invest in your business, they can make at least a 10x return. Think about that for a moment. For every pound that they put into your company, they need to believe that you have the capability to return £10. And so they've really got to be excited by the opportunity, and more importantly, they need to be excited about the business model potential. So consider the business model. How do you charge for the value and the service that you're bringing to the table? Is your business operating as a marketplace, in which case you take a commission? Is your business an e-commerce platform, in which case you earn margin on selling products and services through the platform? Is your business a software play, where you charge a licensing fee or subscription fee? All of these different business models have their pluses and minuses, but it's really important to articulate that story to your investor. And the final consideration is market size. As I previously alluded to, it's really important for investors to believe that they can make a huge return on your company. And in order to believe that, they've got to believe that you're operating in a really large and attractive market, preferably global. Often, investors will only entertain investing in your company if the market opportunity is at least $1 billion in size. And so how do you convey that opportunity to your investors? Be very clear about the addressable market size. Be very clear about the international potential of the opportunity. Be very clear about the types of customers and audiences that your business can address. If you're far too narrow and far too niche, that might put off some investors. And here's a top tip. When you're seeking to raise capital from investors, don't forget that investors are first and foremost buying into you. They're buying into people. As an early stage business, you wouldn't have got everything figured out. You're still pivoting and trying to understand your company. So really remember that it's important to develop that rapport and that chemistry with that investor, because ultimately they need to believe that you are capable of executing the vision that you spell out. So focus on that, and I'm sure it will lead to better outcomes.